Chapter 29. Jamie connects the dots. Jamie had just begun to worry when he heard the distant sound of Jack's and Hiccup's voices. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but he heard Jack laugh, so that was at least a good sign. Obviously, he'd been feeling bad earlier, and probably had been for a while if Jamie knew him right. And maybe less obviously, but still obviously enough for Jamie to have his suspicions, it had something to do with Hiccup, if the long gazes Jack sent Hiccup when Hiccup wasn't looking was anything to judge by. At the same time, Hiccup was acting slightly off too. Jamie had just written it off as jumpiness after meeting the Snow Queen and the trick she'd pulled on him. Why else would he behave so strangely around Jack? Either way, the obvious solution to the obvious problem was to send Hiccup after Jack, because it seemed that grown-ups, or at least teenagers, which Jack technically was despite being 300 and some more, found it difficult to just voice whatever was on their minds. Jamie silently vowed that he'd never be like that once he hit his teens. Everything would be so much easier if they just talked about it. But he also understood that it was easier said than done. He hoped all they needed was a little push. On another note, as uncomfortable as it was watching the two of them skirt around each other, Jamie was worried about how it would affect their quest. It felt crucial that they were okay if they wanted to get through this. And it seemed that, when Hiccup and Jack finally came back to the clearing, they were okay again. They were also, for some reason, drenched and shaking from the cold. Jamie sprang to his feet. "What happened?" he yelped, because he couldn't think of anything able to get Jack to submerge himself completely in water, except for some kind of trouble. Something must have happened. Jack opened his mouth to answer, but no sound came out the first 2 seconds. "Nothing bad," he then said, his smile slightly sheepish. He probably knew what Jamie was thinking. "Just took a bath, I guess." The two of them came to sit by the fire, and Jamie didn't try to hide his confusion. He glanced at Toothless as if he would have an answer for him. He didn't. Baby Tooth, who was sitting on his head, gave a puzzled chirp. "Just in the middle of the night?" Jamie asked slowly. Jack shrugged. "It's hard to explain my thought process." Hiccup huffed a laugh at that. He didn't say anything, but Jamie could tell he was thinking something along the lines of, "I'd hoped at least you would be able to make sense of it." "Okay." Jamie narrowed his eyes. "Do you stop believing in the moon when the sun comes up?" "Do you stop believing in the sun when the clouds block it out?" Jack replied obediently. He tilted his head to the side. "Is it really that weird?" I guess it is." "What's the rune for luck?" Hiccup piped up. "I'm the one who's supposed to ask you that," Jamie said, but then waved his hand dismissively, because it was pretty obvious that Hiccup was Hiccup and that Jack was Jack, even if this whole thing seemed wildly out of character. "So you just took a bath?" he asked again, just to clarify. The two of them nodded. "There's a hot spring," Hiccup explained, though it didn't explain much. Jamie frowned at them for a couple more seconds before he just shook his head and had a laugh. "Okay, I'm glad you're feeling better, at least," he said, "even though that's super random and you're acting weird." Hiccup pressed his lips shut, but Jack just smiled. "Yeah, thank you for sending Hiccup after me," he said, elbowing Hiccup lightly. He scooted closer to the fire. "I did say we probably should have waited until the sun came back up. It's freezing." Hiccup raised his hand, then hesitated, then caught Jamie's eyes, then averted his gaze to the fire before putting his hand on Jack's back and rubbing it in an attempt to warm him up. "We'll be warmer once we cuddle up to Toothless," he said. "It's time to sleep anyway. Let's just dry up a little more first." Yeah, I'm exhausted," Jack said and yawned. He sent Hiccup a grateful smile, which Hiccup now easily returned, as if the previous tension between them had never even existed. Jamie was confused. But Jack and Hiccup seemed to be okay again, at least, so Jamie decided he could try to ask Jack further about what had happened exactly tomorrow. Jack and Hiccup continued the conversation by talking about exploring more of the island once the sun rose, and then about some terrible terror footprints Hiccup had seen earlier, before they eventually fell into companionable silence. Feeling himself getting drowsy, Jamie crawled over to Toothless and leaned against him, scratching his neck absent-mindedly while he studied Jack and Hiccup. Something had changed, and Jamie couldn't tell what it was. On top of Toothless's head, Baby Tooth was studying them as well. She had a slightly pinched look on her face, one that Jamie didn't understand either. Seemed like nobody felt like acting normal this evening. He shook his head and closed his eyes. The pleasant atmosphere transferred over to the next day, which was spent further exploring the island. It was immense, bigger than any other island they'd visited, to the point where Jamie wondered if they'd actually hit mainland. They flew over the pine forest and in between the mountains, which blocked their view of any sign of a shore. However, from almost anywhere they could see the mountaintop where the worshipping site was. The Changeling had brought them to this island because it gave off the same sort of magical energy that Babytooth apparently did. Either there were plausibly more traces of magical creatures to be found, or the mountaintop had enough magical energy to encase the whole island in it. The fact that it was dedicated to the Norse gods made Jamie's chest churn, nervously and excitedly. Jack said he didn't know if the gods were real or not, and if they were, he didn't know if they were truly gods or just spirits that the Vikings believed were gods. Asking Hiccup if he thought the gods were real seemed disrespectful, so Jamie decided not to. On a whole other note, Jamie missed the Changeling. She had been pretty nice company, despite the kidnapping. And after all, it's not every day one gets kidnapped by a dragon. It made Jamie feel quite special, even if the typical abductees of dragons were princesses. "At least the weather's nice," Hiccup commented, after they'd been flying around and across the island for a couple of hours, with no luck. And he was right. The sky was almost cloudless, pale sunlight shining down on them, offering a little bit of warmth to counter the chilly wind blowing lazily past them. Hiccup scratched Toothless behind his ear. "How are you holding up, bud?" Toothless replied with a satisfied growl and swooped playfully downwards in a way that made Jamie's stomach surge. Hiccup laughed. "Do you want to take over for a bit, Jamie?" Jamie turned around to face him, as if to check if he was joking. He hadn't flown Toothless while Jack was also a passenger before, but Jack didn't seem to mind, only grinning when he met Jamie's eyes. The next few hours were spent doing less exploring and more fooling around. The nagging feeling that they really should be doing what they were supposed to do never subsided completely, but it got progressively easier to ignore it as they soared in between the towering mountains, faster and faster as Jamie got the hang of dragon riding. Without saying anything, they all seemed to have agreed they deserved a day off. They set camp on a different part of the island sometime at midday, near a small river. Hiccup made wooden spears for them and showed them how to hunt for fish in the running water. It was time-consuming work, and Hiccup was easily the best at it. To their surprise, Jack wasn't half bad either. They had to stand completely still for long minutes at a time, and Jack wasn't exactly famous for his ability to sit still. North used to say that too, Jack replied when Jamie mentioned it to them as they ate. He kept forgetting I was in the room while he worked on his eye sculptures. There was something in his use of the past tense that made Jamie feel uneasy. He didn't comment on it. Hiccup threw a fish to Toothless, who caught it in the air and swallowed it whole. "Jack also sat hidden on the back of Barfenbelt for several long hours, so I guess I shouldn't be that surprised," he said. "Sometimes I feel like you're being contradicting on purpose, Jack." Gotta maintain my veil of mystery," Jack said, then grinned when Hiccup squinted at him. Babytooth, who was sitting on top of Jamie's head, gave a small huff that went unnoticed by the other two boys. She still seemed to be somewhat grumpy, but for why, Jamie couldn't figure out. It was a nice day. What was there to be grumpy about? They had been exploring, though it felt more like a leisurely walk than anything, on foot for a little while when Jack stopped in his tracks, tilting his head to the side. Jamie heard what he was hearing a moment later. Some sort of animal noises in the distance. It sounded vaguely familiar. Hiccup stood and listened as well, before smiling at Jamie and Jack, nodding at them to follow. They mounted Toothless and flew up a rocky hill before landing quietly and hiding behind some boulders. They peeked past to find a secluded patch of grass, like a secret garden. Stone and rocky mounds surrounded the area, sheltering it from the rest of the world. At first glance, the place seemed empty. Jamie would have thought that they were alone if it hadn't been for the off-key chirps and squawks echoing from the garden. Hiccup pointed at several different spots, and only then did Jamie see what kind of dragons had made their home here. A tribe of terrible terrors, all spread out and dozing off among the rocks or singing lazily together. The moment Jamie spotted them, more of them seemed to appear, and then he wondered how he hadn't seen all the colorful spots among the earth colors. Jack laughed quietly. "Never thought I'd miss their singing," he whispered. "Yeah," Hiccup murmured back. "Sounds like home." Jamie wondered what Squawk was doing. He never had managed to get to know him properly, just like the Changeling. He hoped this wasn't going to be a reoccurring thing. "Terrible terrors are able to deliver things if you train them," Hiccup said. He looked like he tried to make it sound like an offhand comment, but his gaze flickered nervously to Jack.
Messages, I mean. I don't know how far they're willing to fly exactly, but...
Jack's expression softened. Do you want to send a message to Burke? He asked. Hiccup shrugged.
Maybe. It has been a few days since we left. If we sent them a message telling them we were right, then they might not come looking for us, he said.
Then he frowned.
Maybe. They're not good at minding their own business.
I wonder what the twins are thinking, Jack murmured. Maybe reassuring them is a good idea.
Hiccup brightened. We just need to get on these guys' good side then, he said, all but jumping to his feet. I'll do it. Wait here.
As he and Toothless silently crept into the garden, Jack followed them with his eyes, a mellow smile on his face.
Do you think he just misses home?
Jamie asked. Probably, Jack admitted, his smile faltering a little. I guess even someone like Hiccup would yearn for familiarity sometimes, especially when he's so far away from home, both literally and otherwise. Jamie could easily relate to that. He tried not thinking about his own home. They watched as Hiccup beckoned the terrors closer, getting down on his knees to appear less threatening. The terrors, though wary at first, slowly crept up to him and sniffed him curiously. He made it seem so easy. Beside Jamie, Jack sighed fondly, though he didn't seem to notice it. The same warm smile as before was blooming on his face again. What a strange human being, he murmured. Jamie couldn't help but smile too. They retreated to their campsite as the sun set. Hiccup found a piece of bark and etched a message into it. Jamie peered over his shoulder and frowned.
We're all right, don't worry, he read out loud. How will they even know it's you who wrote it? Well, I don't have enough space to explain that we're on a literally magical quest, and also they would think I'd lost my mind if I did. And then they'd definitely come looking for us, Hiccup replied. They'll know. Besides, they do trust you enough to know that you don't have me at knife point to force me to write this or anything.
Do they trust us, though? Jack mused. He was sitting with his legs crossed, his head leaned on his palm. It was a pretty dramatic departure.
Wouldn't they trust you to be able to beat us in a fight?
Jamie asked right after.
Hiccup started, then side-eyed Jamie for a second. Jamie snorted, and Hiccup shook his head. They trust me, and I trust you, he said. So, they trust you.
Jamie sat down beside Hiccup.
I wonder if they would have trusted us if they knew what we were doing, he said.
Hiccup opened his mouth, then closed it again.
Let's not worry about that, he said.
Jack smiled wryly at him, but kept his mouth shut.
We're doing pretty good so far. I'm sure I'll be back home in no time, and then I guess everything will be at least next to normal.
Jack's smile melted off him, his expression changing like a light switch. Hiccup was too busy etching in his message to notice, but Jamie did. Jack inhaled and put on his smile again. Yeah, you're probably right, he said, and the following chuckle sounded only slightly fabricated. Jamie suspected it was probably entirely fabricated. The next day arrived, and since it was just as sunny as yesterday, nobody felt like bringing up the little nagging problem that was their approaching deadline. They ate, then spent another few hours searching and exploring. Still, they found nothing.
Maybe it's time to move to another island, Hiccup suggested.
Jake gave a non-committal hum. Maybe, he murmured.
There are still places to look, Jamie said.
It was true, but he knew deep inside that the real reason he said it was because he wasn't ready to move to a different, possibly less pleasant island, and away from the relaxed atmosphere that had settled over them the past couple of days. Hiccup nodded.
All right, let's head south. Maybe we'll finally reach the other side of the island.
They didn't, but instead found more woods, rocky terrain, and snow-capped mountain peaks, and still nothing magical. Jamie felt a mixture between anxiety and relief. Their luck, at least when it came to locating different sources of magic, seemed to be running out. Even if the Snow Queen, as far as they knew, couldn't hurt them while the ground remained void of snow, time was running out. Look, Jack said, pointing upwards. Far above them, a pack of colorful dragons soared. Deadly netters, Jamie guessed, though they were a bit too far away to be sure. The scales reflected majestically in the sunlight. If Jamie hadn't known better, he would have described it as magical.
They're heading south, too, Hiccup said. Want to take a closer look?
Yes, Jamie cheered. As they caught up with the netters, flying among them with no trouble as if they were dragons themselves, it was easy to shove their anxieties aside for a little while longer.
Jack, Come on. I believe you, all right? You're going to reopen your wounds. Get down from there.
My wounds are almost healed, Jack said, grinning down at them from a branch 4 meters above the ground. Calm down, Your Highness. You worry so much. He clicked his tongue and shook his head condescendingly in a way he definitely knew would annoy Hiccup. Hiccup let out a suffering groan, dragging a hand down his face. Why? He muttered desperately. He looked at Jamie and gestured at Jack, who had begun climbing onto a higher branch.
Why is he like this?
Jamie couldn't say he wasn't also a bit nervous, but he was too entertained to tell Jack to stop. He shrugged.
Would be boring otherwise, he said with a grin.
As always, you're completely right, Jamie, Jack said. He leaned on his arms and hopped onto his toes, because he'd taken his shoes off, of course, then slowly stood up on the branch. Hiccup's arms flailed, as if he was preparing to catch him if he fell. Jack might be a skinny guy, but so was Hiccup, so Jamie doubted it would end in anything less than disaster if Hiccup did attempt to catch him. Of course, Jack didn't fall, but for each time it looked like he was losing his balance, Hiccup's face turned grayer. Babytooth whimpered, zipping anxiously back and forth, seeming as tortured as Hiccup. Toothless watched in something that looked vaguely like confusion, like he didn't understand the point of the stunt. Obviously there was no point, except for Jack to prove to Hiccup that he was as good at climbing trees as he had previously claimed. Jack's eyes settled on something in front of him. Jamie and Hiccup followed his gaze.
What are you planning?
Hiccup demanded. Planning, Jack snorted.
Right. What impulse are you about to follow, then? Because I hope it's not jumping over to that other branch over there. It's too far away.
It's not too far away, Jack said, taking a step further out on the branch he was currently standing. Jamie watched with awe as he inched forward and continued to ignore Hiccup's requests, which were gradually evolving into pleas, for him to come down. His balance was admirable. But then there was a sudden cracking noise, so faint that Jamie almost missed it. He followed the sound with his eyes and gasped.
Jack, the branch!
He yelped. Jack yelped too when the branch started groaning, and he did the only thing he could in that moment, which was to go through with his impulse, more or less. He flung himself towards the branch, but didn't get as far as he needed. Jamie slapped his hands over his mouth. Hiccup surged forward, as did Toothless, but even a dragon wouldn't be fast enough. But then, miraculously, Jack sailed through the air in a way that was almost elegant, and his hands grasped desperately at the branch he'd been aiming for. It only slowed his fall a little bit, but it was just enough for Toothless to catch him. They landed in a wild roll into the bushes. There was a moment of silence. Then a hand appeared from the bushes, giving a thumbs up. Hiccup sighed, exhausted.
I hate this guy, I really do,
he muttered as he and Jamie hurried over. Toothless rolled onto his feet and gave an indignant snort, his tail coming up to slap the back of Jack's head. Jack, who had just been staggering to his feet, fell over again.
Hey! Good dragon,
Hiccup said, petting Toothless as he came to his side. Jack rubbed his shoulder, but seemed otherwise unaffected from the fall, apart from a streak of dirt on his forehead and some leaves in his hair. He sent Toothless a narrow look. You know as well as I do he's no better than me, he said, pointing an accusing finger at Hiccup. But it didn't take too long before the offended frown got whisked off his face, a grin replacing it. See, Hiccup, all is fine. The branch didn't even break. As if on cue, the branch Jack had been standing on groaned, slowly splintering as it broke off the trunk and crashed to the ground. Jack winced. Hiccup raised a brow, as if to ask, And you were saying? Jack looked defiantly back at him for only a moment before he burst out laughing.
Don't enable him.
Hiccup tried to groan when Jamie joined in, but there was laughter in his voice as well. Even Toothless seemed to forget his grumpiness. Jack wiped a tear from the corner of his eye. Well, anyway, he sighed. Told you I could climb trees.
And I told you I believed you when you got to the first branch,
Hiccup argued, an exasperated chuckle escaping him. He reached up and brushed some leaves out of Jack's hair, and the gesture would have seemed entirely natural if it hadn't been for the awkward way he retracted his hand again.
Just some leaves,
he explained lamely. Jack tilted his head to the side in a silent question and brushed off the rest of the leaves. Then there was a moment in which they just looked at each other in silence before Jack smiled in a way that was almost secretive, like they'd just had a mental exchange. Hiccup averted his gaze, his mouth a thin line. We should go, he said in an unsteady chuckle, and then did exactly that without waiting for an answer. Jamie started to follow, the gears in his mind turning to make sense of what he'd just seen. He met Jack's eyes, and Jack just shrugged, like he also was confused, like he wasn't in on whatever had just passed between them, which just confused Jamie more.
"What was that?"
he whispered. "What was what?" Jack replied. Jamie squinted at him, then shook his head. Whatever. He supposed it was a teenager thing. They found another hot spring the next day. Jamie wondered if one of the mountains could be a volcano, but none of them could say for sure. Either way, they took the chance to wash the dirt off themselves and enjoy the warm weather. Enjoy was maybe not the right word for what Jack was doing. Jamie couldn't help but study him in order to figure out what had been going through his head that other night. But this time, Jack barely got into the water, at least not in the deepest part of the pond. He seemed to be in a good enough mood, but gave no hints whatsoever to explain why he had taken that impulse swim with Hiccup. And neither did Hiccup, who asked Jack once if he wanted to come further in, and when Jack said no, he just nodded. It was on their way away from the hot spring that Jamie posed the question.
"Is it okay if I ask why you didn't get in this time?"
Thankfully, Jack didn't seem offended. It seemed more like he'd seen the question coming. He shrugged. "I'm just not there yet," he admitted. "But maybe one day." They walked in silence as Jamie thought about this.
"Hiccup is helping you?"
he asked. Jack didn't quite meet his eyes, but there was a soft smile on his face. "He tries his best," he said, "and I guess he's doing a pretty good job, too. He has an impressive amount of patience, I gotta say." He laughed, a little sheepish. The sound brought a smile to Jamie's face as well.
"Patience is sort of like stubbornness," he said. "Maybe that's why."
"That's a very good point," Jack grinned. "Maybe you understand him better than I do." Jamie looked ahead to where Hiccup and Toothless were walking. He wondered if Hiccup was listening in on the conversation. Jamie knew he would, if he were Hiccup. "I think he's pretty weird," Jamie admitted after a few contemplative seconds. This made Jack laugh again. Hiccup finally decided to teach Jamie how to fight with a sword, and it was, Jamie thought, about time. He'd been waiting for this almost since his first day on Berg. Of course, Jack had been teaching him a bit, but his fighting style wasn't exactly traditional, and either way, due to his injury, he hadn't any chance to teach Jamie lately. Right now, however, Jack was sitting on a low branch of a tree, which he had started doing for the sole reason of annoying Hiccup, watching Jamie's sword fighting lesson with a grumpy expression. He'd wanted to spar as well, but according to Hiccup he was still not healed enough, and had been refused to join. "How's anyone supposed to remember all that strategy?" Jack complained. "I thought Vikings were supposed to be unhinged. Just all—" He made slashing motions with his staff. "Like that."
"Well, a bunch of us are,"
Hiccup said, clearly unimpressed by Jack's imitation.
"But like you imply, it's not very strategic."
Jack yawned. "So much theory," he muttered.
"Do you want to take over?"
Hiccup asked pointedly. Jamie shared a look with Baby Tooth and shook his head. This kept happening.
"I would, but I'm not allowed to,"
Jack sniffed. "Even though my shoulder is completely fine. You've seen it. It's healing."
"It's not healed yet," Hiccup argued. "Stretching it will only slow the process."
Jack hopped down from his branch and spun his staff around restlessly. He walked over to Hiccup and pointed at his face. "The wound you got from the snow eagles," he said. "It looked pretty bad at first, but look at it now."
"I can't actually look at my own face," Hiccup replied.
"Jamie, describe to Hiccup how his wound looks," Jack said, and crossed his arms like he was about to deliver the winning argument. Jamie held back a sigh. He looked up at Hiccup, and then frowned when he realized Jack wasn't just being stubborn. The wound on Hiccup's cheek did look much better, despite how bad it had looked only a few days ago.
It looks fine, actually,"
he admitted. Jack smiled. "Yep, and I think I know why," he said. "We were both harmed by the Snow Queen's puppets, and both of those times she didn't actually have the power to hurt us." Hiccup traced his fingers across the wound on his cheek, which was mostly just a red line now.
"So, since it was magic, the wounds don't heal as normal wounds would," he concluded.
"That's what I think," Jack said. Hiccup squinted.
"And you're not just making this up so that you can spar?"
he asked. "Hiccup." Jack raised his brows in a haughty manner. "Even if I didn't have a reason to get around your royal orders, you know I would have ignored them if I felt like it. But no, I'm not making it up." Jamie's eyes moved by themselves to Jack's frost brand. This was good news, yet he couldn't help but think about how the brand started to hurt every time the Snow Queen was close.
"You don't think that means the wounds will get worse once it's winter, do you?" he asked.
This effectively put a stop to the playful atmosphere. "Nah," Jack said after a few seconds, but he didn't sound sure. Hiccup frowned.
that would indicate we wouldn't be okay unless we got rid of her for good," he said.
"It's not the same as this," Jack said, pointing at the brand. "I was with her, actually with her, in her territory when I got this. The wounds aren't the same."
"She told me she could be killed," Hiccup argued.
Jack drew himself up. "You can't kill spirits, Hiccup," he snapped. "It's possible to make them disappear, but humans can't kill a spirit in any other way than forget them." He paused for a moment, like he was surprised by his own outburst. "I just don't want to take any more risks," he said, quieter now. Jamie felt as if he should say something, but he didn't know what. Jack's gaze was lowered to the ground, and for a few seconds nobody spoke.
"But how do you know for sure?" Hiccup asked. "If there's a chance—"
Jack looked up. Whatever Hiccup saw in his expression, it made him trail off. "How do I know that spirits can't be killed?" he asked back. Hiccup nodded, and Jack shook his head. "I just know things, Hiccup," he muttered. "I don't think you'd like the answer." Jamie's mouth fell open. Hiccup looked confused. He always looked confused when Jack was being cryptic. "What, Babytooth?" Jack said suddenly, turning away from Hiccup. "Could I talk to you?" Babytooth had been playing with Toothless. At least she had the last time Jamie checked, but it seemed she'd been observing the downward slope of Jack and Hiccup's conversation as well. She chirped a reluctant reply, flying up to his side. "I just remembered something," Jack explained, smiling stiffly. "I'll be back in a moment. Maybe you two can take a flight with Toothless meanwhile." Hiccup's expression softened.
"All right,"
he said. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out for the first couple of seconds. He sent Jack an apologetic smile.
"I know you're worried. I won't do anything stupid."
Jack's smile turned a little bit more genuine. "No, that's my job," he said. "Sorry for snapping at you. Really, though, you should take Toothless for a flight. He looks miserable." Then he and Babytooth walked away from the campsite, leaving Jamie and the others in slightly confused silence. Toothless came up and headbutted Hiccup, cooing curiously.
"Do you—"
Hiccup started when Jack was out of earshot.
"Do you know what he's talking about?"
Jamie did, but he wasn't about to say. It wasn't his secret to tell. Hiccup knew this, however, because the next thing he said was,
"I'm not asking you to explain. I just hope he's not completely alone in whatever's going on up there."
He tapped his own temple. "Whatever's going on up there," Jamie's mind echoed.
"I know some of it, but—"
He trailed off. There was a pause, only broken when Toothless gave another noise, a little more impatient this time. Hiccup smiled at him.
"Want to fly?"
he asked Jamie. The atmosphere wasn't ideal, but Jamie nodded anyway, and maybe flying would do the trick and cheer them up. Jack still hadn't come back when they landed, which either meant that something bad had happened, or Jack was isolating himself again. Jamie decided enough was enough.
"Jack!"
he called out, walking in the direction that Jack had earlier.
"Where are you?"
He didn't get a reply, and walked for a bit more before he tried calling out again. Jack couldn't have gone that far, which meant that if something bad hadn't happened, he was ignoring him.
"Jack, I'm walking into the woods, and if you don't tell me where you are, I'll get lost."
He stopped and waited. A few moments later, Babytooth appeared in front of him. She said something, but of course Jamie didn't understand. At least she didn't seem annoyed, but there was something off about her attitude. Jack was sitting in a tree again when Jamie saw him, which meant that it wasn't solely to annoy Hiccup after all. He sent Jamie a wry smile. "Sly tactic," he told him, with a hint of admiration in his voice.
"It worked, didn't it?"
Jamie replied. He peered doubtfully at the tree, but made an attempt at climbing it anyway. Jack watched him struggle for a few moments, snickering without remorse, before giving in and helping him up.
"It would be easier if you just came down."
Jamie groaned as he pulled himself onto the branch, holding tightly onto Jack. "Yes, but it wouldn't be as fun," Jack said. "I like to be above the ground." Jamie snorted. He kept close to the tree trunk, while Jack sat leisurely about half a meter away, his legs dangling in the air. Babytooth settled on a smaller branch a little above them, her tiny brows furrowed in what looked strangely like caution.
"Do you miss flying?"
Jamie asked. Jack nodded. "Could be worse, though. We have Toothless. Did you have fun?"
"Yes, but Hiccup is worried about you."
"Why are you so honest all the time?" Jack muttered, running a hand over his face. Jamie resisted the urge to reply. Someone has to be.
"Not talking about it isn't going to stop it from being real," Jamie mumbled.
Jack's shoulders sank in a silent sigh. "I know," he said, scratching his cheek. "Shouldn't have lost my temper back there." Jamie fidgeted with the hem of his tunic.
Maybe I shouldn't have asked that question about the Snow Queen,
he mumbled.
It's not your fault, Jamie,
Jack said, shaking his head. Asking questions is a good thing. Jamie pursed his lips, then looked up at Jack.
Then I have a few questions,
he declared. Jack met his eyes with an amused smile and nodded. Ask away, he said, waving his hand. It took a few seconds before Jamie decided which of his many questions he wanted to ask first. He leaned his head against the trunk of the tree and looked up at the sky.
Do you think the Norse gods are real?
He settled on, keeping his voice quiet just in case the gods in question could hear him.
I mean, do you think there's a chance?
As more than spirits? Jack narrowed his eyes in thought. I really don't know. Humans have so many different gods. If something like gods were real, I don't know how they would be different from spirits. Except maybe they're not dependent on belief in order to be powerful or visible.
What about the mountaintop?
Jack shrugged. Could just be the belief in the gods that gave it its magic, he said. Besides, the Changeling led us there because she felt like Babytooth had the same energy. And Babytooth isn't a goddess, as far as I know. He sent the fairy in question a smile, and Babytooth returned it shyly.
It has to be pretty powerful, though, doesn't it? Jamie asked. Because we haven't found any other traces, but even Hiccup said that place seemed
different, Jack finished and nodded slowly. I'm not sure. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time to give up on this island. It wasn't the answer Jamie had been hoping for. At the same time, he knew it was the most obvious answer. Jamie was quiet for a few seconds.
It's been nice here,
he then mumbled.
Tiring, but still, sort of relaxing too.
Jack hummed. It has, hasn't it? This brought Jamie to another thing that had been bothering him and that he hadn't been able to figure out just by observing. He just didn't know how to phrase the question because he wasn't even sure if he was just imagining it at all or if something really was different.
He started. Are you...
He sighed when the words didn't come to him, and Jack raised a brow. Am I what? Jamie met his eyes.
Why did you say that to Hiccup earlier? He asked. The thing about him not liking the answer to why you know things about spirits.
Jack didn't answer. His eyes started away, lips pressing together reluctantly.
Because I've just been thinking,
Jamie continued, because he didn't want this conversation to turn sour too.
I mean, you seemed so, well, happy the past few days. Not that you don't seem happy other days, you do, but it feels like something is wrong at the same time. Or maybe just different?
Jack was frowning. I'm not sure what you mean, he admitted.
Maybe it has something to do with that hot spring, Jamie mused. It started after that.
Oh, Jack tilted his head to the side thoughtfully. He was quiet. Then he smiled. I think I'm just glad to have a friend, to be honest. I've never had someone like Hiccup. Jamie's musings came to a stop. He looked at Jack. Was it really that simple?
You have friends,
he said. Yes, but I never really did when I was human. I think, despite all that's bad, I've sort of grown to like some parts of being human again. Jack looked into the air. His words seemed happy, but his expression was solemn. I'm not sure how exactly, but while I was in the water and Hiccup was helping me, it just made it very clear all of a sudden. He glanced at Jamie, then gave an embarrassed chuckle. Sorry, that's so sentimental. Jamie suddenly felt incredibly stupid. So much for being good at reading people. It really was that simple, and it was so painfully obvious too. Jack was happy because he and Hiccup had grown so close. But he also knew that they would have to say goodbye eventually. And it seemed like, judging by how reluctantly he was admitting to enjoying his time being human again, he felt guilty about it. Because what was highest on the list of Jack's priorities was to protect Jamie, to be the guardian he felt he was supposed to be. Jamie had seen how happy Jack had been back at the frozen pond in Burgess after they defeated Pitch. He'd also seen how much Jack missed his powers, especially flying, and how painful it was for him to be forced to flee from winter, and to see powers so like his own be used in such a malicious way. Yet his time here, no matter how human and how powerless he was, rivaled all of that. If only it meant he'd have Hiccup beside him. There was a cold, nauseating twisting in Jamie's chest.
Don't you miss the Guardians?
Jack turned to look at him, unsurprisingly noticing the change in Jamie's mood. Of course I do, he said.
But what about your powers?
I miss my powers, too.
What's wrong, Jamie?
Jamie swallowed heavily.
I just thought that, he started haltingly. After what you told me, being Jack Frost sounds a bit hard sometimes. So maybe you'd like to stay here instead? Maybe Jackson Overland is better.
He found it hard to get the words out and harder to meet Jack's eyes. But Jack gave a sigh and moved closer, putting a hand on Jamie's upper arm to invite Jamie to look up at him. You don't have to be afraid of that, Jamie, he said. We're going to go home.
I'm not afraid of that,
Jamie said. He had to keep his voice quiet in an attempt to hide his quavering.
I know you'll do anything to get us home because that's just what you like. But I'm afraid that because of that, you'll get us home even if you don't really want to go home. Even if this is your happiest place, you're going to choose my happiness over your own happiness.
Jake's mouth was slightly ajar as he stared at him. He looked like he wanted to argue, opening his mouth, but then he just closed it again, along with his eyes. He shook his head, letting his hand fall. It's not just about you, he murmured. I'll admit it's mostly about you, but even if I was here alone, even if there was absolutely no part of me that wanted to go back, I still couldn't have stayed.
Why not? Jamie protested. That's the thing that's different, isn't it, Jack? You're happy like this, aren't you?
I'm happy as Jack Frost, too. I told you that, Jack argued, opening his eyes again.
But this is a different kind of happy. It's an alive kind of happy.
Jamie stared at his folded hands, trying not to wring them as he spoke.
A human kind of happy.
Jack seemed to deflate before Jamie's eyes. He ran a hand over his face and nodded. I know. I feel it too, and you're right, he mumbled. Then he took a deep breath and let it out in a shaky sigh. But I know too much to stay in the past. It could change things. The risk is too high, especially while hanging around someone who will be chief one day. Hiccup is in a position that's too influential. He shouldn't even be here. He shouldn't know about any of this stuff. He shook his head wearily. If I were smart, I would never have befriended him in the first place. Jamie knew this well enough. They still didn't know what effect they'd had on the future just by existing in this time, and he knew he'd misspoken enough times already. Staying here and probably accidentally revealing more secrets about the future was obviously a bad idea. However, Jamie knew that wasn't the only reason why Jack hadn't told Hiccup about his previous magical occupation. Hiccup already knew everything else except for Jack and Jamie's origins, and he was very clear on his opinions on magic. Jack didn't want to tell him about Jack Frost and risk ruining their friendship. Still, something was not adding up.
You say that, but what you said to him earlier was riskier than anything else you've told him, Jamie said. It was almost a giveaway, wasn't it?
Jack was quiet. His head slightly hunched over on the branch, his shoulders drooping. He managed after a few heavy seconds of silence. It's not risky because it won't matter in the end. Even if I told him everything, of us, of the future, of the world, it wouldn't matter. He took another deep breath and sat up straighter, looking up at Babytooth. When I spoke to the Guardians through the crystal, Babytooth got some time to speak with Tooth and ask for advice. Babytooth sat very still. She looked back into Jack's eyes, still with that same wary expression from before, like she was nervous or guilty. And, Jack continued, there was a faint tremor in his voice, but in every other way he had the appearance of someone completely unaffected. He traced the ridges of his staff. And Tooth gave us a solution to that problem. She's the guardian of memories, after all, and her powers channel through all her fairies, even those trapped in a different time. The cold feeling in Jamie's chest turned somehow colder. He thought he knew where this was going. So when we leave, Jack said, Babytooth will use that power, a bit unconventionally, and I guess not entirely morally correct, to take the memories of us with us.
They won't remember us?
Jamie whispered. Jack shook his head. It will be like we were never here. Jamie's mind flashed back to Brand and the others, and Squawk and the Changeling, and Gobber and Stoic, Astrid and even the twins. He hadn't known them for long, but the thought of being forgotten by them made him feel hollow. It's for the best, Jack muttered, though the uncaring facade he put on in order to deliver this news was quickly fading. We won't screw up anything in the future, and Hiccup can continue living his life without worrying about any sort of winter spirits.
Jack,
Jamie said. Jack glanced briefly at him, but there was a gleam in his eyes that made him look away. He exhaled softly. "Yeah, I'm not happy about it either," he said. He gave a half-hearted chuckle, shaking his head. "I've sort of been hoping against hope, because I know it's impossible that these days that we spent here could last forever. At least a few more days before." He broke off, turning his head away. I don't want to be forgotten, Jamie thought to himself, but he also understood the necessity of it. Still.
"Can't there be another way?" he asked. Maybe at least Hiccup can remember."
"Hiccup is the worst candidate," Jack said. He turned back with half a smile. "Maybe the twins. People wouldn't believe them anyway, or Gobber." Jamie didn't feel like smiling.
"I don't want to be forgotten,"
he whispered, unable to keep it in. Jack's smile died. "I know," he said, and whatever was in his voice made Jamie's eyes blur. Jack brushed his hand over Jamie's hair and brought their foreheads gently together. "I know, but we're going to be all right." Another day was spent looking for magic, and now everything was so much clearer. Jack's mood fluctuated between bright and blue so easily, not just because of the knowledge that he would have to leave Hiccup behind sooner or later, but because everything that had happened since they appeared on Berg would be virtually erased. It was bad enough for Jamie, who had grown fond of this life and its people despite the hardships. Jack was still a whole other story. Babytooth mostly kept to Jamie after the conversation. She seemed forlorn as well, as if all of this was her fault. Jack had explained to Jamie that she'd been keeping quiet about it because she accurately guessed that someone who'd been non-existent to the world before wouldn't like the idea of being forgotten. On the one hand, this could be worse. To find something precious and then having it ripped away just like that. At the same time, Jamie was grateful for her secrecy. Jack probably wouldn't have grown as close to Hiccup as he had if he'd known he was going to be erased anyway. And Jack deserved that happiness, even if it was temporary. And so, Jamie made a decision. If they did end up leaving, and Hiccup ended up forgetting, then the days before that were even more precious. If Jamie could help it, he wanted to give Jack as much time together with Hiccup as possible. Preferably time that wasn't filled with life-threatening problems, but beggars can't be choosers. Once more, the sun began setting before they found any sign of magic, and they were forced to think about food instead. They'd flown over a huge lake during the search and settled nearby to hunt for fish. This time, Hiccup and Toothless took responsibility for catching it, and Jamie and Jack tended to the fire and just sat and watched as Toothless swooped up and down over the water. Every now and then they'd go too deep, and Hiccup would give a complaining groan, getting wetter each time. Jack looked like he made a sort of attempt at holding back his snickering when Hiccup and Toothless came back dripping wet, the former wearing a disgruntled face. He glowered at Jack, but slowly started smiling.
"Okay, you know what?"
he said, and started to approach Jack, opening his arms menacingly.
"You look like you need to wash up before dinner."
Jack's laugh got stuck in his throat. "Don't you?" He didn't get any further before he was attacked. Their battle lasted for about 10 seconds and ended when Jack stumbled over a root and managed to whack Hiccup in the face with the staff when he flailed. Toothless took over and made sure Jack was covered in equal amounts of water and dragon drool.
"Gross,"
Jamie laughed. Hiccup grinned.
"Welcome to my life,"
he said, making no attempts to save Jack even when he called for help. Instead, he sat down by the fire and ruffled his own hair, spraying water all around him. Jack staggered to his feet. "Thank you, Toothless. I appreciate it," he said, wiping his spit off his face, then flicked it at Hiccup. They prepared the food and ate. It tasted like nothing, with a hint of something that was definitely not tasty, but Jamie had gotten used to that by now. He wondered what his mom would have thought of him right now, muddy and living in the wilderness, hunting their own dinner and riding dragons. Would she be more horrified or proud? Jamie knew she liked going on walks in the forest, but this was maybe a little excessive.
"Something wrong, Jamie?"
Hiccup asked. Jamie became aware of the long sigh he just let out. He looked up from his speared fish to find Jack and Hiccup looking at him.
"No,"
he replied. Jack only raised a brow for Jamie to give in. He shrugged.
"Just thought about Mom."
He almost wished he hadn't said it when both their faces fell. Jack nodded. "She always seemed very understanding, from what I've seen of her," he said, one corner of his lips quirking upwards. "Even if she does force you to drink bitter tea." Jamie smiled lightly.
"Yeah, she never understood the whole magic thing, though," he said, and sent Jack a meaningful look. "She will, though."
Jamie, Jake started with a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. I don't think.
But it's possible, isn't it? Jamie interrupted. Do you know that's not possible?
Jack opened his mouth, but didn't say anything, which told Jamie the answer was no.
What's this about?
Hiccup asked, understandably confused again.
How come your mother doesn't understand magic when you do?
Jamie knew that Hiccup now knew he and Jack weren't brothers, but it still was weird, in a way, to talk so openly about it. He'd grown very comfortable with that role. It was the only lie he truly appreciated. Grown-ups have a tendency to forget, Jack mumbled.
Forget?
Hiccup repeated, his brows furrowed.
Doesn't seem like a thing you'd forget.
Jack glanced at him, but quickly looked into the fire instead. He shrugged. I don't think the world would be well off if that stuff was common knowledge, he said. I'm sure people are just meant to forget, to keep things from descending into chaos.
Not all of them, though,
Jamie said. A horrifying thought had just occurred to him.
I mean, I wouldn't forget, even when I grow up.
He didn't pronounce the desperate right, but it was clearly there.
When you grow up,
Jack repeated, with only the slightest hesitation, like it pained him to say it. He was pouting a little, his gaze going distant.
I've never met anyone like you, Jamie. I wouldn't know.
Maybe North and Sandy know. Jamie frowned.
I definitely won't forget.
Hiccup shook his head.
Grown-ups, why?
He started, then looked at Jack.
How old are we talking, then? Wouldn't you have forgotten by now if that was the case?
Once again, Jack opened his mouth to answer, but then closed it again with a frown.
I'm not sure, he mumbled. Maybe I would forget.
There was silence. Jamie stared at him. Suddenly he didn't like this conversation anymore.
Can we go flying?
He asked, getting to his feet and taking the rest of the fish in one bite, even if that meant he would be picking bones out of his mouth for the next 10 minutes. He skipped over to Toothless before waiting for an answer, who had perked up at Jamie's suggestion.
Come on, Toothless. Let's go flying.
Hiccup didn't notice the abrupt change of subject, but Jack looked like he did. Neither of them commented on it. The former got to his feet.
You coming, Jack?
Actually, Jamie said,
I was wondering if I could just fly with you, Hiccup. I need to talk to you.
Hiccup's and Jack's reactions were almost identical, but Jack looked a tad more offended.
I just feel more pressured with the bigger audience,
Jamie mumbled. That was a lie. He'd gotten a little better at that lately. Hiccup looked amused.
I get it. We'll be back soon, Jack. Keep the fire alive, will you?
Jack nodded slowly. Jamie got the feeling he wasn't completely fooled, but he let Jamie and Hiccup fly away anyway. Once they were up in the air, Hiccup let Jamie take over. Jack became smaller and smaller below them, but he was always visible in the light of the fire. He was looking up at them.
Okay, so what was that about?
Hiccup asked. Jamie froze. Okay, so maybe he wasn't as good at lying as he thought. And now that he was up in the air with no means of escape, yes, he knew that this was his own fault, he was suddenly nervous. Was he meddling too much? No. Jack was too afraid to do anything on his own, especially now with Baby Tooth's news. Jamie turned around.
You like Jack, right?
He asked. Hiccup blinked.
What?
Jamie raised his brows.
You like Jack,
he repeated, slower this time.
Right? Yes?
Jamie sent him a weird look.
Why do you sound so unsure? No, I don't,
Hiccup protested, even though he clearly did. His eyes kept flickering around like he was debating whether or not the lake was too far beneath them for a dive. Whatever Jamie had been expecting, this reaction wasn't it. Then Hiccup leveled him with a look that was definitely suspicious.
Why do you ask? I just want to say that you should be honest about it,
Jamie said, carefully choosing his words.
Because Jack he's afraid of losing people, so you should be open about that, liking him.
Hiccup stared at him for a long, long time.
What?
Was his eventual answer, his voice weak. Jamie didn't understand what was so complicated. He was about to say that, but then Toothless suddenly jerked sideways, and he had to turn around and adjust the tail fin.
Sorry, Toothless,
he said, and got a grumble in reply. Maybe he should keep his eyes on the road. The sky? Ahead.
Is this?
Hiccup started uncertainly.
Hold on, are you trying to warn me right now? What? No,
Jamie said, finding this conversation weirder and weirder as it went on. He snorted.
You Vikings are so weird. Why would I warn you?
When Hiccup didn't answer, Jamie looked over his shoulder again, frowning at him.
What's the matter with you? What's the matter with me?
Hiccup protested.
What is this? How?
He let out a shaky breath, glancing down at Jack, then back at Jamie.
Is it obvious?
It was Jamie's turn to stare, trying to decipher Hiccup's cryptic responses.
That you like Jack?
Hiccup looked embarrassed. His ears were turning red. He also looked horribly confused and a little scared.
Yeah?
He said in a small voice.
I mean,
Jamie started. Then he blinked, and blinked again. Hiccup kept looking at him fearfully, like he was on the brink of panic. To react like that at the request of being someone's friend was completely nonsensical, but Jamie's mouth was hanging open.
Oh,
he whispered.
You like him?
Hiccup looked about ready to jump off, fatal distance be damned.
What?
He snapped.
No, I mean, yes, but...
But Jamie's mind was already flashing back to all the times he'd caught Hiccup and Jack cuddling up together while they slept. He'd had a thought at Eden and Runes when he saw them, but what that thought had been had never been entirely clear to him. And now it was.
You do?
He gasped, and almost turned completely around in the saddle in his surprise.
What do you mean, I do?
Hiccup nearly yelled, but lowered his voice to a hiss at the last second, as if he was afraid Jack would hear.
You're the one who asked for a private audience to talk about this. I just wanted you to know that Jack never had a friend like you before.
Jamie shot back, and a smile was beginning to spread on his face. Slowly, and then he was laughing.
I didn't... Is it true? Am I right? No,
Hiccup yelled. Toothless growled worriedly.
You shouldn't lie to children, Hiccup,
Jamie scolded. Then his laughter came to a sudden stop as the reality of the situation hit him. He looked down at Jack again, then up at Hiccup.
But, really,
he said,
is it like that?
Hiccup opened his mouth, the protest clear on his face, and then sighed. He closed his eyes for a moment and was looking away when he opened them again.
This isn't... You weren't supposed to... Oh, man.
He ran a hand over his face. Jamie felt a little bad for laughing. He didn't know much about crushes. He knew Pippa had one on Caleb, but that was about it. It had seemed like a hassle then, and it seemed like a hassle now, judging by Hiccup's distress. And he had a crush on Jack, of all people. If only he knew.
It's okay,
Jamie tried, but didn't know what else to say. He hadn't been prepared for this outcome.
You cannot say anything about this,
Hiccup said, his voice suddenly serious as he met Jamie's eyes again. His expression was borderline pleading.
Why not?
Jamie asked. Hiccup gestured exasperatedly down towards Jack.
He doesn't think like that,
he said.
Jack isn't... I mean, he barely seems human sometimes. I can't imagine he'd ever feel something like that towards anyone, much less towards me. It would just make it weird. I'm not even sure if I feel that.
There was an awkward silence. Jamie scratched his head. Maybe Hiccup was right. Jamie couldn't really see it either. But then again, Jack had shown many sides of himself during their time in the past that Jamie had previously thought him to Jack Frost to have. But what did he really know about Jack Frost, or Jack Snoverland, when it came to stuff like that?
I don't know,
he admitted slowly.
I won't tell him, though.
Hiccup lowered his gaze and nodded.
Thank you,
he muttered. He looked miserable. Jamie halfway regretted coming up here. The other half was glad. This cleared things up a little more. He turned ahead. The mountains were looming in front of them.
Hiccup,
he said, a little unsure of what was the best thing to say in this situation. So he just went with the truth. That mostly seemed to be the better option.
What I said about Jack, that he's never had someone like you, I meant it. But he doesn't say things like that out loud, because it's too cool or something, I don't know.
He shook his head.
He told me, though, when I spoke to him yesterday, but I guess I should have figured out that one on my own. There's just something different about him when he's around you."
Hiccup was quiet.
"You must know him well,"
he murmured. Jamie shrugged.
"Never as well as I think." "What are you saying exactly?"
It was a very good question. Though, when he thought about it, maybe it was exactly what Hiccup had initially thought. A kind of warning.
"Just don't let him push you away, I guess," Jamie said. "He deserves to have a friend like you, even if it's temporary." "And why are you telling me this?" Hiccup asked. "Of course I'll be his friend. I appreciate him."
Jamie smiled. Then he thought about what Jack had just said before the subject was abruptly changed by Jamie, and his smile wavered.
"That's good. I trust you," Jamie said, and swallowed thickly. "Because I think maybe he'd rather stay behind if he had the choice."